Okay, right, address the camera, Jim. It's absolutely sweltering in this room. And I've got a lung infection. I'm on antibiotics for lung infection. So I don't know if I'm sweating because I'm sweltering or sweating because I've still got the remnants of this fucking infection. Anyway, I tried to put a video on in the background that I thought would have some relevance to what I'm going to talk about here, which is this whole business of toxic masculinity. Or rather, not so much talk about the business of toxic masculinity, but the way that it's sort of evolved in the public lexicon into, I suppose you could say, a kind of new bogeyman to sit alongside the patriarchy, a new kind of universal target for our blame, isn't it? If there's some ill that's happened, then this is one of the latest things that you can blame. And in that regard, it has a kind of amorphous aspect, doesn't it? We don't really need to define what toxic masculinity is. All we really need to say is that toxic masculinity is to blame for it. But I think if it is to mean something, it needs to be a little bit more tangible than that. Otherwise, blaming toxic masculinity is of no more value than blaming civilization or blaming the human condition. So perhaps the first thing that we need to consider is to define what masculinity actually is. After all, if we can't define masculinity as something tangible, then effectively what we're doing when we talk about toxic masculinity is more or less tilting at a windmill. We're pushing at something that isn't there. This is how Wikipedia defines masculinity. Masculinity, also called boyhood, manliness or manhood, is a set of attributes, behaviours and roles generally associated with boys and men. Masculinity is made up of both socially defined and biologically created factors. So the reason that I wrote out the Wikipedia definition isn't because it's the first definition that I came across and I couldn't be bothered to go any further, but of all the definitions that I read, it was one of the ones that I thought was the most reasonable, because the bit that it included that I liked was the fact that it acknowledged masculinity as having some basis, or preparing to accept the possibility that masculinity has some basis both in social conditioning, culture and environment, but also having a biological underpinning. And I think that's a really, really important thing to consider, because outside of that, if we strip it of that, as some people would have us do, then I think we get into the same kind of situation that we have with gender identity, which is that there are people out there which will tell you that gender identity is entirely the result of cultural conditioning and it has no biological aspect to it whatsoever. And yet, how then do you explain for this example of gender dysphoria? If your gender identity is simply as a result of cultural affirmation, of everybody telling you you're a little boy and this is how little boys should act, then how can you grow up with everybody telling you you're a little boy and this is how little boys should act, and yet your brain throughout that whole process rails against that to such a degree that it can make you feel suicidal? If there's nothing biological railing against that, then I don't see how that makes sense.
And say that person, once they discover their sense of self, go, no, I'm not a boy. And we've already seen and I know that you've had to study it because of your work in social work, but things like the case of John and Joan.
Yeah.
Where, and this is something that was mentioned in the comments of parents forcing their child or deciding for their child what gender they are and saying that they're trans when they're not. The case of John and Joan, John was born John, had a very horrific accident due to circumcision, and they decided to raise John as Joan, did the surgeries, and raised him as a girl, claiming that they were a girl, telling him that she was a girl, putting her on hormones, dressing her, all of that stuff.
Oh, it was so tragic.
And basically, John fought back. He said he was never Joan.
Yeah.
Because that was his gender wasn't female, but they were trying to force it.
And the same thing is true here, because it's often said that toxic masculinity doesn't refer to all masculinities, but just to some masculinities. But what does it even mean to talk about all masculinities if masculinity doesn't have some kind of biological underpinning? After all, as we can see in that Wikipedia definition of masculinity, for masculinity to mean something, we need to be able to unpack masculinity and define a set of characteristics that are involved in it. But if there's no biological underpinning of it, then any characteristic whatsoever going in any direction could potentially be a masculine characteristic, including those characteristics that we'd usually regard as feminine characteristics. Indeed, any femininity could be a masculinity, and any masculinity, including what is being called toxic masculinity, could also be a femininity. We end up in this absurd set of circumstances, don't we? Whereby something such as the inability to show our emotions when showing our emotions would be helpful could be seen, as it is already, as an example of toxic masculinity. But then at the same extent, being over-emotional, crying at the drop of a hat could be seen as an example of toxic masculinity as well. It is just that it's referring to a different masculinity. From my perspective, if masculinity is as open-ended as that, then effectively masculinity isn't really referring to anything very much at all. It's just too amorphous for us to even get a grip on. And in some ways I'm kind of minded to end this video here, because one thing that I find somewhat objectionable is that the same socio-political school of thought that objects to characteristics being regarded as masculine characteristics in the main, if somebody makes the argument that the reason that men proliferate more in positions of power is because men are more interested in power, men are more aggressive, men are more competitive, they object to those qualities being described as masculine qualities. How can they be? Women can have these qualities just the same as men. This is just social conditioning. This is all bullshit. And yet when these same characteristics are being framed in a negative light as toxic characteristics, then they're quite happy to label those characteristics under toxic masculinity. I don't really think you can have your cake and eat it on this one. Either these characteristics are masculine characteristics or they're not. I'm not going to end the video there because I think that there's quite an important argument that can be made here. You see, I think the problem is in the popular sphere is that particular characteristics start being seen as toxic rather than specific instantiations of those characteristics. And actually, if you go and read a bit about toxic masculinity, you'll see that at the slightly higher level, not the kind of level that you'll read in Salon or Jezebel or something like that, that they do tend to differentiate between this, but this differentiation gets lost somewhere down the scale. And so we end up with the situation where specific traits are getting labelled as negatives when actually they're not. And this is the part that I find ironic, is that we've been here before. God, we've been here before for decade after decade after decade, and we should have learned our lesson by now, because we've gone through all of this once before, and we've gone through it with regard to femininity. If I'm being brutally honest, right, if we're all being brutally honest, that go back more than a decade or two, the problem wasn't considering masculine characteristics as negatives, it was considering feminine characteristics as negatives, and the masculine characteristics as superior to the feminine equivalents. And now it seems that we're in danger of lionizing and promoting feminine characteristics as universal goods and masculine characteristics as universal societal ills. We're doing the same thing that we did before. It was wrong when we did it the first time, I think, because what we tended to look at is women I've got to be honest with this, because it was naive and unsophisticated way of doing it, and it was unfair on women. It was unfair on femininity, that we would regard the way that women express emotion as a sign of weakness, that the way that women tend to be more cooperative, to look more for consensus, maybe to be a little bit less competitive, in terms of things, maybe sometimes to be a little bit less rational and a little bit more emotional, as necessarily negatives. And I think that was an entirely wrong-headed way of doing it. Now, are these things never wrong? Of course they're not never wrong. It's not that these things are never negative, because of course sometimes we need people to be entirely rational. Sometimes we need people to be very, very dispassionate. Sometimes we need people not to show their emotions. Sometimes there are decisions that need to be made. And we don't need people to break down and start showing their emotions. We need people to maintain a poker face and just irrationally arrive at that decision. Right? But most of the time that is not the case. Most of the time we need some kind of balance. So it's not that these characteristics are universal weaknesses or universal strengths. Whether they're strengths or weaknesses is very much situational, which is why these characteristics have evolved in the first place. If they were simply weaknesses, nobody would have them, would they? It's that they're situational. These characteristics can be strengths, they can be weaknesses. It depends upon the situation, and of course it depends upon the extremity to which these characteristics are expressed. Now, I propose to you that maybe society is still on a journey with regards to femininity and those characteristics which form what we understand as femininity, but it's on the right path there. I'm on that path there from younger versions of me, and I think society is. But isn't it odd that as we're on that trajectory with femininity and re-evaluating feminine characteristics, we seem to be meeting masculinity going in the wrong direction. And all the mistakes that we made with regard to those feminine characteristics, we're doing the same fucking thing again with those masculine characteristics. I seem to be pissing water out of my head at 15 to the dozen there. But the interesting thing is, the really ironic thing is that the very people that I would have expected to object the most to treating feminine characteristics as universal ills are the ones that are happiest to employ terms like toxic masculinity to do exactly the same thing with what we regard as masculine characteristics. Can I suggest a slightly more sophisticated approach, which is that most of these characteristics exist in some kind of tension and balance with one another? Woof, and I just wanted to add a little bit in here just so there's no misunderstanding. This is not to say that all men are at one end of the masculine end and all women are at the feminine end, any more than to say that men are on average taller than women means that all men are 5'10" and over and all women are 5'10" and under. Of course you can have a woman that's 6'2", you can have a man that's 5'2". It's to suggest that there's a general trend in regard to that, but none of that is to suggest that individual men and women are in any way limited in terms of their personal characteristics. And at the extreme ends of each scale lies the toxicity. If you break down in tears at the drop of a hat, when you need to make a decision because something bad has happened and you're incapable of doing it each and every time that crops up in your life, then you are going to struggle to function as a human being, and you're going to rely on everybody else to pick up the pieces at each touch and turn. Right? That isn't a healthy position to be in. But at the same stage, if every time something tragic happens in your life, you bury it, you just bury it, you refuse to talk about it, you can't cry, you can't show any emotion about it, that isn't a very healthy set of circumstances either. Between those 2 points lies an array of healthy responses. some of which will function better in some sets of circumstances, some of which will function better in other sets of circumstances. That is why evolution has gifted us with different responses, with different response patterns, with different arrays of personality traits. So it isn't a case of good characteristics and bad characteristics, and I would hope that we can stop referring to masculinity, to those characteristics that we regard as constituting masculinity, as being negative characteristics, and limit that term to those instantiations of those characteristics which are the most extreme, which are the most egregious, which are the ones that are obviously harmful under most reasonable and normal sets of circumstances, the same as we are starting to do with feminine characteristics. Maybe the main thing we need to start doing is looking at the characteristics themselves rather than bundling them all together in these packages and then just trashing the packages themselves. Maybe that's what we really need to be doing. Okay, well, thank you for listening to what I have to say. I think I'm going to go and get a drink before I wither away into a dehydrated pool of nothing. Bye for now.